That late afternoon, the sun gilded the windows of the small wooden house where Margaret had lived for over 40 years. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, calmly embroidering, when a car pulled up in front. Two men in ties got out, carrying papers, forever changing the course of her life. The doorbell rang, and with it came the feeling that something wasn't right. The grandmother's heart raced before she even opened the door. One of the men, with a cold stare and a firm voice, announced, "You must leave the house within 30 days." It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also want to take this opportunity to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot, thank you. Now, let's get back to the story. Margaret looked around the room and saw the portraits of her children when they were still young, the worn rug where they used to play, the smell of coffee still lingering in the air. How could they say this place no longer belonged to her? The house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was her very life. Neighbor John, who always came by to help fix the fence, saw the men leaving and ran to find out what had happened. Upon hearing the news, his eyes widened and he gripped her hand tightly, as if trying to hold back the avalanche that was about to come. "This can't be real," he said. That night, Margaret could barely sleep. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she remembered the day she and her late husband, William, bought the house. She remembered the hastily painted blue walls, the housewarming party with the neighbors, and the promise that they would grow old together there. The children were notified, but the reaction wasn't what Margaret expected. Robert, the eldest, said he couldn't help financially. Susan, busy with her job in another city, seemed distant. Only Linda, the middle child, cried on the phone, begging her mother not to give up hope. With each box Margaret began to fill, a piece of her story fell apart before her eyes. Hand-embroidered napkins, old letters, family Christmas memories. And within each object, a silent voice seemed to ask, how could someone rip away an entire life like that? But something strange happened the next day. While organizing documents in the attic, Margaret found a yellowed envelope hidden under a loose floorboard. The paper was old but intact. Her heart beat faster. She opened the envelope with trembling hands and saw a name she hadn't read in over 50 years. A name no one in her family knew. It was as if the past, carefully locked away, had decided to resurface at this very moment of fragility. And suddenly, the eviction stopped being just a tragedy. It also became a calling, a push from fate, bringing a forgotten truth to light. Margaret knew her life would never be the same, but she had no idea of the storm that was about to brew. The silence in the house felt heavier than ever. Every step I took, every drawer I opened, every box I closed brought to light secrets hidden in dark corners. Grandma felt God was showing her something, preparing her for a greater revelation. A visit to the bank the next day only confirmed the worst. Old debts, unpaid bills, documents lost over the years. Margaret couldn't understand how this had happened, as she had always believed her affairs were in order. "It's a mistake," she said, but the bureaucracy wouldn't listen. John, the neighbor, offered temporary shelter in his home. But Margaret didn't want to be a burden to anyone. Proud and dignified, she thanked him but declined. "God will provide," she whispered softly, hugging her threadbare coat against the chilly autumn wind. The days passed, and the countdown seemed to crush her shoulders. Each morning, she woke up staring at the walls, memorizing every detail, like someone saying goodbye to an old friend. It was impossible to accept that soon, those walls would no longer hear her. Susan, the estranged daughter, called one rainy night. She bluntly told her that it wasn't worth fighting, that it was better to hand over the house and move on. The words fell like stones on the mother's heart. How could her own daughter talk about giving up? Deep down, Margaret felt something was wrong with this story. The eviction seemed too sudden, too fast. As if someone had an interest in speeding up the process. But who? And why? Questions began to echo in her mind. As he prayed in his living room, before a small Bible open to Psalm 23, tears wet the pages. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," he whispered. And in that moment, a breath of courage pierced his weary soul. The next day, Linda arrived unexpectedly. She walked in with a suitcase in her hand and a tight hug for her mother. "I won't let you go through this alone," she said. Margaret cried, as if she'd finally found a safe haven amidst the storm. Linda helped pack clothes, sort documents, and organize paperwork. But when she saw the old envelope on the table, she realized her mother was hiding something. "What is it, Mom?" she asked, her eyes filled with suspicion. Margaret froze for a few seconds. She considered lying, but couldn't. She handed the envelope to her daughter, knowing that once opened, there would be no going back. Linda read it silently, her eyes filling with tears. "Mom, this changes everything," she said, her voice breaking. Margaret took a deep breath, as if releasing a weight held for decades. "I never wanted you to find out like this, but maybe it's time." Her hands clutched the crucifix around her neck, as if seeking strength to face what was to come. Outside, the wind blew hard against the windows, as if nature itself were participating in the scene. Margaret knew she could no longer hide the truth. Whatever was written on the envelope had the power to unite or destroy her family once and for all. And so, the eviction stopped being just a pain. It became the trigger for a bigger story, a revelation no one expected. The next few days would be decisive, and the grandmother already felt the battle was just beginning. The clock was almost midnight when Margaret decided to write a letter. With a trembling hand, she began to put on paper words that had been trapped for decades. Words that could explain the inexplicable. Words that carried love, regret, and courage. She knew the moment of revelation was coming. What no one imagined was that this revelation would have 3 unexpected consequences, capable of forever changing the fate of that family. But before she could finish the letter, a strange sound echoed from the kitchen. Margaret stood up, startled, and walked slowly toward it. The window was ajar, and a cold wind was blowing in through the crack. On the table, the envelope was no longer where she had left it. Her heart raced. Someone had tampered with her secrets. But who could have entered that house? And, more importantly, with what intention? Margaret looked at the front door and realized it was unlocked. That night, for the first time, she was afraid of being alone. The eviction was no longer her only concern. The past was alive, walking inside her own home. And Margaret had no idea how she would face what was yet to come. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains, illuminating the boxes stacked around the room. Margaret took a deep breath before resuming the arduous task of packing her life into pieces of cardboard. Every corner of that house held memories, and each memory seemed to scream that she couldn't leave. As she opened an old wooden chest, she found the wedding dress she had worn when she married William. The fabric was yellowed with age, but it still exuded the sweetness of that unforgettable day. She closed her eyes and saw herself walking down the aisle, her heart racing and her faith in God overflowing. At the bottom of the trunk, an old Bible lay with worn pages. Inside, Margaret found a dried flower bookmark. She smiled as she remembered how William would always pick daisies for her in the nearby fields. "You are the flower that never fades in my life," he would say. Yet each object brought not only joy, but also the pain of loss. As she held a woolen coat knitted by her own mother, tears welled up. It was as if the past had silently returned, reminding her that all the people she loved were no longer with her. As she sorted through the old portraits, Margaret stopped in front of a black-and-white photo. In it, she held a child no one in the family knew. Her grandmother ran her fingers along the glass of the frame, her heart racing. Who else would remember that story? She knew she couldn't leave that photo exposed. She quickly placed it in a separate box, but the weight of the secret seemed to grow with each passing second. And within her, the certainty grew. Perhaps the dumping was just the beginning of something greater that God was preparing. In the kitchen, the cabinets still held mugs bearing the children's names. Each one carried memories of noisy breakfasts, echoing laughter, and silly fights that quickly turned into hugs. Now, those mugs were empty, cold, like the house itself. Linda, her middle daughter, was helping with the packing. Finding an old tin biscuit box, she opened it curiously. Inside were letters tied with a red ribbon. "Mom, what are these?" she asked. Margaret was silent for a few seconds before replying, "Letters that shouldn't exist." Silence filled the room. Linda realized her mother harbored secrets that went beyond financial hardship. Secrets that perhaps explained why, in so many moments of her childhood, she noticed distant looks and hidden tears. Margaret didn't want to reveal everything at once, but she knew she would soon have no choice. The weight she carried was too great, and perhaps it was time to share at least part of the truth. After all, time was running out, and the house seemed to conspire to keep nothing hidden. In the living room, an antique wall clock still ticked away. Margaret remembered how William would adjust the clock every Sunday night before church. It was as if time in that house had its own rhythm, and now it was coming to an end. Going upstairs, she found her grandmother's old patchwork quilt, hand-sewn by her grandmother. Each patch was a different fabric, pieces of old clothing belonging to the entire family. Margaret ran her fingers over the quilt, remembering the cold nights she would snuggle under it with her young children. Suddenly, Linda found a small music box hidden in a drawer. When she opened it, the soft melody of Amazing Grace began to play. Margaret placed her hand on her chest and let out a deep sigh. That music always reminded her of times when God had rescued her from sadness. But not everything the house held were good memories. In one of the cash registers, Margaret found old bills, collection notices, and paperwork that made her feel guilty. How had she allowed the debts to pile up without realizing it? Perhaps she was so focused on the past that she forgot to consider the present. As she walked down the hallway, the creaking of the floorboards seemed louder than ever. Each step echoed like a farewell. She stopped in front of her children's bedroom door and slowly opened it. The scent of childhood was still there, as if time had stood still. In the corners of the room, old toys lay forgotten. Robert's metal car, Susan's doll, Linda's diary. Margaret held the diary for a few moments, remembering when her daughter would hide it under her pillow. She smiled as she flipped through the first few pages, but stopped when she found something unexpected. Inside the diary was a note that didn't appear to be Linda's. The handwriting was different, firm, almost masculine. The words read, "One day, all will be revealed." Margaret felt a shiver run through her. Who had written that? She slammed the diary shut, trying to convince herself that maybe it was just her imagination. But the feeling that someone was watching her memories grew stronger. It was as if the house were alive, wanting to speak through the objects it held. Linda noticed her mother's frightened expression and insisted on knowing what was happening. Margaret looked away, saying only, "Some things belong in the past and need to stay there." But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep silent much longer. In the garage, Margaret found the old bicycle Susan used to ride to school. The seat was worn, the chain rusted, but looking at it brought back memories of sunny mornings and races around the neighborhood. Nostalgia and sadness mingled in every detail. As she walked through the yard, she stopped before the tree William had planted the day Robert was born. Now the tree was enormous, its branches nearly touching the sky. Margaret placed her hand on the trunk and murmured a prayer of gratitude, asking for strength to endure what was yet to come. With each discovery, the house seemed to guide her to something greater. As if God used each object, each memento, to remind her that she was not alone. That even in the midst of loss, something precious was being revealed. In the living room, Linda found a photo album she'd never seen before. Opening it, she noticed half the pages were blank, but the first few photos showed unfamiliar people. "Mom, who are these people?" he asked. Margaret simply closed the album firmly. The tension was mounting. Linda wanted answers, and Margaret fought her own fear. Each object revealed more than it should, like puzzle pieces slowly falling into place. The problem was, what final image would emerge from this enigma? Amidst the cleaning, Margaret decided to make some tea. As the water boiled, her gaze fell on an old medicine chest. Inside was a bottle with the label nearly faded. Picking it up, she felt a chill run down her spine. That bottle held a story no one had ever heard. Linda noticed her mother was shaking and tried to comfort her. But Margaret pulled away, saying she needed some time alone. She went upstairs and closed the door. Inside, he knelt before the bed and prayed intensely, asking God for clarity and courage to face what was about to happen. The wind outside began to blow harder, making the windows rattle. Margaret looked around and realized it wasn't just a house being emptied. It was as if the walls were speaking, revealing a story hidden for decades. With tears in her eyes, she clutched the closed album to her chest. "Lord, if it is your will, let the truth come out." And in that instant, she sensed something much bigger than the eviction was about to be revealed. Margaret didn't know it yet, but inside those boxes, Among old clothes and forgotten papers, lay the secret capable of completely transforming her family's destiny. And the next step was inevitable, the revelation everyone feared. The night was silent when Margaret returned to the envelope she'd found in the attic. She clutched it like a stick of dynamite, afraid it would explode at any moment. She knew that inside that paper was something that could forever change the way her children viewed her. With trembling hands, she slowly opened it. Inside were old documents, yellowed letters, and a birth certificate. But it wasn't for any of the children everyone knew. It was for a child named Daniel, with a different last name. Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The memory of that name came back like a flash. Daniel, a piece of her soul that had been ripped away decades ago. Now, the secret she had kept for so many years was before her eyes, ready to be discovered. Linda, curious, entered the room just as Margaret tried to hide the papers. "Mom, what is this?" Her grandmother stood still, knowing she could put it off no longer. "It's something you need to know, but you might not want to hear it." The tears began to flow before the words could even come out. Margaret said that before marrying William, she had become pregnant by another man. Daniel had been born in secret, but due to family pressure, he had been given up for adoption. No one had ever known of his existence. Linda was shocked. "Mom, you had a son? And you never told anyone?" Margaret just nodded, her voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting you all. But now I see I was just hiding." The daughter didn't know what to feel. While she was moved by her mother's pain, she felt betrayed by so many years of silence. "You always taught us to trust in God and in each other. Why did you deny us that truth?" Margaret cried uncontrollably. "I was afraid of losing you, afraid that you would judge me, afraid that William would never forgive me. So I kept quiet. And that silence consumed me my entire life." Linda, trying to process everything, asked, "And what happened to him? Where is Daniel?" Margaret lowered her head. "I never saw him again. But I never went a day without thinking about him. And now, maybe, he's alive somewhere." While the two were talking, Susan arrived unexpectedly. Sensing the awkward atmosphere, she asked what was going on. Linda hesitated, but Margaret decided not to hide it any longer. She handed her the papers. Susan's silence was even more deafening. Susan dropped the documents on the table and stared at her mother coldly. "So our whole life has been a lie." The prosecution cut like a knife. Margaret tried to explain, but her words fell on hardened ears. Robert was also called. When he heard the truth, he exploded in anger. "So you had another child and never told anyone? And now what do you expect? For us to just accept it?" The weight of the revelation began to tear the family apart. Margaret found strength in her faith. "Children, I made a mistake, but God knows my heart. He knows how much I suffered in silence. I didn't hide it out of malice, but out of weakness. And now, perhaps He wants everything to be revealed." Linda, the most sensitive, held her mother's hand. "Maybe this is the chance for redemption. Maybe it's time to find Daniel." The words brought hope, but they also opened an even deeper wound. Susan shook her head. "What if he doesn't want to be found? What if he hates us for all this? Have you thought about that?" The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The room seemed too small for so many conflicting feelings. That night, no one could sleep. Margaret sat with her Bible on her lap, praying that God would show her the way. "Lord, if it is your will, let me find my son before I leave this house." The next day, Linda began searching through old files and adoption records. Margaret watched her with a heavy heart. Each click on the computer seemed to bring her closer to a past she never thought she'd revisit. Hours later, Linda found something, a partial record confirming the adoption of a baby named Daniel, in the same year and city of birth as the papers. Margaret felt her legs tremble. Robert, still suspicious, accused, "Maybe this is a fabrication. Maybe you're just making up an excuse to cover up something else." The words stinged like arrows, but Margaret held her gaze steady. It was then that Linda, almost in disbelief, said, "There's an address associated with that record. Maybe it's his." Silence fell in the room, heavy, as if fate were being written right there. Margaret clutched the crucifix around her neck. "If it's God's will, I will see my son again. But I'm afraid of what he'll think of me." Susan snorted in disgust. "You should have thought of that 40 years ago. It's too late now." But deep down, even she couldn't contain her curiosity about who Daniel was and where he was. John, the neighbor, upon learning the secret, surprised everyone with a revelation. He remembered old rumors that Margaret had disappeared for months in the past. "I thought it was strange, but I never wanted to ask," he confessed. The revelation not only rekindled the past, but also raised new questions. Who was Daniel's father? Why didn't Margaret ever reveal his name? And why has that envelope reappeared now? Margaret didn't have all the answers, but she knew she could no longer run. Whatever it is, it's time to face it. Her words felt like an oath, a definitive step into the unknown. While everyone was discussing, a letter slipped out of the envelope without anyone noticing. It was handwritten and ended with a disturbing sentence: "One day, I will return for what is mine." Margaret's heart sank. That handwriting wasn't hers, nor William's. It belonged to someone from the past who still held power over her present. The secret wasn't just about Daniel. There was something much darker involved. The walls of the house seemed to close in on her. The eviction, already painful, now seemed almost insignificant compared to the avalanche of truths about to crash down on everyone. Margaret knew one thing: this was only the beginning. The revelation of her lost son would open the door to even greater secrets, capable of destroying or redeeming her family. And as she put the papers away again, an unsettling feeling came over her. She wasn't the only one carrying secrets. Someone, somewhere, was also about to come forward with their own version of the truth. The next morning, the house seemed quieter than ever. Sunlight streamed through the windows, but the atmosphere was heavy and stifling. Margaret was making coffee when she heard hurried footsteps. Robert entered first, his face grim, followed by Susan and Linda. Robert slammed his hand on the table. "I still can't believe it, Mom. You've been hiding a child from us your whole life. What else are you hiding?" His tone echoed through the kitchen like a hammer of judgment. Susan crossed her arms, cold and distant. "You made us live a lie, Mother. While we believed our family was complete, you carried such a secret." Her words were sharp as blades. Linda tried to intervene, but she was also shaken. "Mom, I understand the pain you've been through, but we also have a right to the truth. Why didn't you ever trust us?" Margaret's silence was almost unbearable. She took a deep breath and replied with a shaky voice: "I didn't want you to hate me. I thought I was protecting you. The weight of this secret crushed me for decades, and now you know why I spent nights hiding tears." Robert stood up abruptly. "Protect? You call that protecting? You tricked us, Mother. You made us believe in something that never existed." He left the room for a few seconds, unable to control his anger. Susan stepped closer and looked her mother in the eye. "And Father? Did William know? Or did you also trick him to death?" The question struck like a bolt of lightning. Margaret clutched the crucifix around her neck before answering. "Your father. William found out years later. He forgave me, but asked that the secret die with us. He didn't want it to destroy you." The silence that followed seemed to freeze the air. Susan shook her head in disbelief. "So Dad lied too. It was all a sham. How can I trust anything you said?" Her tears were streaming, but her voice was hard. Linda, overcome with emotion, held her mother's hand. "I can't hate you, Mom. I just wish you had trusted us. Maybe if we'd known sooner, we could have helped find Daniel." Her words brought a breath of hope amid the chaos. Robert returned to the room, his eyes red. "What if this Daniel guy shows up now? What do you expect, Mom? That we just accept him as a brother? I'm not ready for that." Margaret, her voice breaking, said, "I don't expect anything. I just want to ask for forgiveness. If God allows me to see Daniel again, I will face it with humility. But you must choose whether you want to walk with me or against me." The words struck a chord with Linda, but they only deepened the resentment in Susan and Robert. "You talk about forgiveness, But you forget that we were the ones who were deceived, Susan said. You're the one who needs forgiveness here, and I don't know if I can give it. Suddenly, Linda stood up. Enough. We can fight for the rest of our lives, or we can try to understand. God doesn't place burdens greater than we can bear. Maybe this is the time for redemption, not destruction. The atmosphere was tense. Robert looked at Linda sarcastically. Always you trying to be the peacemaker. But what if Daniel wants nothing to do with us? What if he hates us? Margaret cried again. I don't know what will happen. I only know that the truth has already emerged from the darkness. Now we have no choice but to face it. And whatever the outcome, we need to be together. Susan looked at the documents on the table and sighed. I don't know if I can stay by your side, Mom. I feel like I've lost you. The mother I knew is gone. Just then, John, the neighbor, knocked on the door. He'd overheard part of the argument and entered hesitantly. Sorry to intrude, but I need to talk. Margaret isn't the only one carrying secrets on this street. His words landed like a bombshell. Robert turned around angrily. What are you talking about, John? The neighbor hesitated for a moment before saying, I know more about this Daniel than you think. And maybe I know who his father is. Everyone was shocked. Margaret's eyes widened, her entire body trembling. John, you can't be serious. But he just nodded, his gaze heavy. Linda held her mother's hand, trying to calm her. Mom, did you know about this? Did you know he had some connection? Margaret shook her head, confused. I never imagined. I thought this secret was mine alone. Susan exploded. So not only did you hide a child, but now we find out the neighbor knows more about our lives than we do? That's insane. Robert approached John, almost threateningly. If you know anything, speak now. The neighbor took a deep breath and said, I'll just say one thing. Margaret's past is closer than you think. And maybe Daniel isn't just a distant memory. The words left everyone breathless. Margaret clutched her chair, nearly collapsing. It was as if the world were crumbling with each revelation. Linda, in tears, pleaded, Mom, we need the whole truth. No mincing words. The time has come. Margaret, her eyes brimming with tears, replied, You are not ready. But the time will come, and then nothing will be the same. The living room clock struck noon, but time seemed to have stopped. Every second weighed heavily, every word a splinter. The family was torn between anger, compassion, and despair. Margaret stood slowly, leaning against the table. I can't change the past. But I can choose the truth from now on. And if you don't accept me, I will endure. Because God never abandons me. Susan looked away, fighting back tears. Robert huffed, still furious. Linda hugged her mother, trying to shield her from the judgment of others. But everyone knew peace was far from being achieved. In that instant, something broke within the family. The secret Margaret had kept to protect them now tore them apart. And yet, deep down, everyone sensed this wasn't the last revelation. There was more darkness to come. And so, the house that had always been a place of laughter now became a courtroom of memories and hidden truths. Margaret knew the battle was just beginning. And the coming days would reveal even more painful secrets. That night, Margaret sat alone in her room, clutching the envelope containing Daniel's documents. Her children's voices still echoed in her mind, like hammers pounding mercilessly. But when she closed her eyes, she no longer heard the screams of the moment, but rather old memories that came flooding back. She found herself 18 again, walking the narrow streets of a small rural town. Back then, she was a young woman full of dreams, full of faith, but also naive. She never could have imagined that one choice would change her entire life. His name was Thomas. He was a handsome, light-eyed young man who worked in an auto repair shop. Margaret remembered how her heart skipped a beat whenever he smiled. It was a forbidden love, because her family disapproved of the relationship. Against all odds, she surrendered to her passion. And when she discovered she was pregnant, her world fell apart. At that time, being a single mother was a heavy burden. The judgmental looks, the cruel words. She felt alone in a desert. Her mother, stern and strict, was the first to say, "You won't destroy our family with this scandal." Margaret cried through the night, asking God for a way out. But the doors all seemed closed. Thomas promised he'd stay by her side, but he suddenly disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. Her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was in this silence that Daniel was born, shrouded in tears and uncertainty. At the hospital, Margaret had no choice. Pressured by her own family, she signed adoption papers. She never forgot the moment the baby was taken from her arms. His cries were etched into her soul like an eternal wound. She spent weeks in silent mourning. No one spoke of Daniel. It was as if he had never existed. But Margaret knew that a part of her had been buried along with that secret. Over time, she met William. Unlike Thomas, he was kind, hard-working, and had unwavering faith. William didn't know about her past when he proposed. Margaret hesitated, but accepted, believing she could start over. In the early years of their marriage, Margaret lived in fear that the truth would come out. William sensed her hidden sadness, but he always said, "God forgives, Margaret. What matters is what we build from here on out." It wasn't until years later, when Susan was born, that William discovered the secret. Margaret broke down in tears, telling him about Daniel. She feared he would abandon her, but William did something unexpected. He hugged her and told her he still loved her. "You made a mistake, but you're not alone. Love covers a multitude of sins," he said, quoting the Bible. It was on that day that Margaret realized William was the man God had placed in her life. Even so, he demanded an oath, that the secret would never be revealed to his children. "I don't want them to carry this burden. We'll protect them." Margaret agreed, even though she knew it would be an emotional prison for the rest of her life. But her heart could never forget Daniel. Every Christmas, every birthday, I wondered where he was, how he was, if he still thought about her. And every time I looked at my children, I saw the reflection of the lost boy in their eyes. Margaret remembered one night in particular. She was alone in the living room when she heard a noise at the window. Looking outside, she saw a figure that quickly disappeared. For a second, she thought it was Daniel, now an adult, trying to see her. She'd never told anyone about it. She thought it was just her imagination. But now, with a note found in the diary saying, "One day, all will be revealed," the fear returned with a vengeance. What if Daniel had really been around all these years? Memories consumed her. The smell of the hospital, the pressure from her family, Thomas's abandonment. Every detail seemed etched in fire. Margaret felt the past coming back to claim its toll. And as if that weren't enough, she had recently discovered an old letter from Thomas. In it, he said he would return for what was his. "Our son will not be raised by strangers." But he never returned. Until now, she believed it was just an empty threat. The weight of silence gnawed at Margaret. Every prayer she said asked forgiveness not only for herself, but also for the son she could never raise. "Lord, keep Daniel safe, wherever he is. And if it is your will, let him find me." She kept a small lock of the baby's hair, hidden inside a book of Psalms. This was her only physical contact with Daniel, a piece of innocence she never allowed to be thrown away. Linda entered the room and found her mother hugging the book. "Mom, you still think about him every day, don't you?" Margaret just nodded, tears streaming silently. "I never stopped loving my son. Never." The past seemed to suffocate her. With each flashback, she realized there was no longer any hiding. The eviction from her home was just the trigger. The real earthquake came from within her. Susan, upon hearing the full story, couldn't hold back her tears. "Mom, I didn't know I'd suffered so much. I thought you deceived us out of selfishness, but now I see it was pain." Robert, still resistant, murmured, "But why didn't you ever look for him? Why did you wait all this time?" Margaret replied, "Because I was afraid, and because William asked me not to destroy our family." Silence fell over everyone. It was impossible not to feel compassion, even in the face of so much pain. The image of the strong, stern mother now transformed into a broken woman, bearing invisible scars. But the revelations wouldn't stop there. John, the neighbor, returned with new information. "I think I know what happened to Thomas. And if I'm right, Daniel's story is quite different from what you imagine." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. If Thomas was truly involved, Perhaps the secret wasn't just about a lost son, but about something much darker. And so, the silent past she had tried to hide her entire life began to speak louder than ever. Daniel's voice seemed to echo in her heart, calling her to the truth that would soon surface. It didn't take long for the secret to spread beyond the walls of her home. Within a few weeks, the small town where Margaret lived seemed to know every detail of her life. Neighbors whispered on the sidewalks, and disapproving glances followed her everywhere. At the grocery store, the cashier avoided looking at her. She simply delivered the groceries hurriedly, as if afraid to approach. Margaret felt marked, as if an invisible label had been stuck to her forehead. On the park bench, two women deliberately commented loudly, "Imagine hiding a child for so long. What kind of mother does that?" Margaret heard, but chose to keep walking. Her heart ached, but she stood her ground. John, the neighbor, tried to defend her whenever he heard nasty comments. "You don't know what she's been through. Don't judge without knowing." But his words were of little use. The town seemed eager to condemn her. At the local church, the pastor delivered a sermon on forgiveness and mercy. Many took the hint, but not everyone was willing to forgive. Some congregants approached Margaret with affection, others walked away in silence. Susan, already resentful, used the weight of public opinion to reinforce her anger. "See, Mom. Now everyone's talking about us. You've destroyed our reputation." The words fell like stones on Margaret's heart. Robert, though furious, remained silent in front of his neighbors. But at home, he vented his frustration. "I can't stand being labeled the son of the woman who hid a baby. I didn't choose this shame." Linda, on the other hand, defended her mother whenever she could. "She's human, she made mistakes, but that doesn't make her bad. Everyone has sins, but hers came to light." Even so, she also suffered from the looks of pity and judgment at every corner. One morning, Margaret went out to buy bread and was surprised by a neighbor named Betty, who said in a tart tone, "Is it true that your lost son is back? Or are you going to make up more stories?" Margaret was speechless, swallowing her pain in silence. However, not everything was rocky. An elderly woman named Grace approached, placed her hand on her shoulder, and said, "Daughter, don't listen to what anyone says. Only God knows the heart. And He still has plans for you." These words were like balm. Little by little, Margaret realized she was fighting a battle not just against her family, but against the entire city. Every step on the street was a test of faith, every unkind word a temptation to give up. One night, someone spray-painted the wall of her house with the word, "lie." Margaret knelt in tears before it, feeling the weight of rejection. But she stood up and said softly, "I am not a lie, I am a daughter of God." John helped repaint the wall, trying to erase the marks of cruelty. "Don't let them destroy you, Margaret. They talk because they don't know your whole story." But even he seemed to be harboring secrets he hadn't yet revealed. At the fair, Margaret heard a group of men laughing and commenting, "If he hid one child, imagine what else he hid. Maybe there are more out there." The vicious comments were like poison spreading quickly. But amidst all the judgment, there was a surprise. The local mailman, a simple man named Mike, approached and said, "Ms. Margaret, my mother was also forced to surrender a child. You are not alone. I understand your pain." Those words were like a spark of hope. Perhaps, after all, there were other people living similar stories, hiding silent wounds. The difference was that her secret was now exposed. Susan, upon learning of the support Margaret received from some people, became even more enraged. "They just feel sorry for you. But I won't lower myself. I won't carry that shame with me." Robert, torn, began to grow quieter. Deep down, though he was angry, he realized his mother's pain was real. He saw her crying alone at night, and for a moment, he remembered the woman who raised him with unconditional love. Linda stuck by her mother's side, but she also suffered from the gossip. "They're not just talking about you, Mom. They're talking about me, about all of us. But I don't care. I know who you are, and I know God is with you." Margaret was grateful, but she still felt the crushing weight of rejection. Sometimes she thought about simply giving up her search for Daniel. But something inside her told her she had to keep going. One day, John brought unexpected news. "I heard Daniel might be in a nearby town." I don't know if it's true, but maybe it's time to look." Margaret's heart raced. The town, however, seemed to conspire against it. A group of residents suggested that Margaret should disappear from the area, that it was best for everyone. She listened in silence, but something sparked inside: courage. At a church meeting, Margaret stood up and spoke publicly for the first time. "I have sinned, yes. I have made mistakes, hidden them, and suffered. But I am no different from any of you. It's just that my sins have been given a voice. I choose to forgive you, even if you don't forgive me." There was silence in the room. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others remained with their arms crossed, certain in their judgment. But a few stood up to embrace her. This scene marked a turning point. For the first time, Margaret realized she didn't need everyone to accept her. She just needed to stand firm before God. However, the tension wouldn't end there. A mysterious letter was left in her mailbox that same night. There was no sender, just one sentence: "Your past is closer than you think." Margaret felt her heart freeze. She didn't know if it was a threat, a warning, or a sign that Daniel was truly near. But one thing was certain: the battle was just beginning. And while the town talked about her, the real storm was yet to come, one that would bring mother, children, and the past they all believed buried face to face. After so many accusations, Margaret found in faith the only safe place to rest her soul. Every night, she knelt beside her bed, her Bible open to Psalm 91, asking God for refuge and protection. "Lord, you are my shelter, my strong castle," she whispered through tears. The walls of the house might crumble, the neighbors might judge her, but inside, Margaret felt that God was still present, sustaining her with invisible hands. Linda accompanied her mother in many of these prayers. Together, they sang heartwarming old hymns like "How Great Thou Art." The melody echoed through the house, transforming the heavy atmosphere into a place of peace. But it wasn't easy to maintain faith in the face of so many attacks. Susan, cold, scoffed, "Praying won't bring Daniel back, Mother. Nor will it erase what you've done." These words hurt, but Margaret remained silent, knowing that only God could convince her daughter's heart. One night, Margaret dreamed she was walking through a field of flowers, holding hands with a smiling child. When she woke, she cried uncontrollably. She believed God had given her a vision of Daniel, a sign that he was still alive. Robert, though reluctant, began to draw closer to his mother's silent prayers. Sometimes he would stand in the bedroom doorway, simply watching her talk to God. Inside, a flame began to ignite, though he wouldn't admit it. At church, Margaret began attending Wednesday services. There, some brothers welcomed her, reminding her of the passage in Romans, "Where sin abounded, grace did much more abound." These words brought relief, as if God were cleansing her wounds. At one of these meetings, the pastor told the story of the prodigal son. Margaret couldn't hold back her tears. He felt the parable reflect his own life: a lost son, a mother waiting, and a reunion that might be near. Linda held her mother's hand and said softly, "I believe God will still bring this family together. He specializes in the impossible." Margaret smiled through her tears, hugging her daughter as if it were an immediate answer to her prayer. Even so, the temptations to give up were constant. On cold nights, Margaret would sit alone in the living room and ask herself, "What if I never find Daniel? What if I die without seeing him again?" Fear haunted her faith. But whenever those doubts came, she remembered Isaiah's words, "Fear not, for I am with you." These promises were her foundation, her steady rock in the midst of the storm. One Sunday, Margaret was called to testify in church. With a broken voice, she told part of her story. "I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes, hidden them, and suffered. But God has never left me. He is my comfort." Many wept as they listened to her. However, some still looked at her with suspicion. It was impossible to change everyone's heart at once. Margaret knew this, but she remained steadfast, believing that God worked in the unseen. One day, she found a small wooden cross in the mail, left without a return address. There was no note, but it seemed like a gift from someone who wanted to remind her that she was not alone. Margaret kept the cross by her bed as a sign of hope. Linda believed it was a message from Daniel. "Maybe he's trying to get closer, Mom. Maybe he knows who you are." Margaret, overcome with emotion, hugged her daughter. Faith and hope intertwined in her heart. Susan, however, grew increasingly hard. You live on illusions. This Daniel probably isn't even alive anymore. And if he is, he must hate you. Her words felt like knives, but Margaret chose to pray rather than respond. Robert, silently, began to question himself. What if my mother is right? What if God really can restore what was lost? For the first time, he considered searching for Daniel with Linda. One afternoon, Margaret sat in the garden with her Bible. The wind was blowing gently, and she opened to Jeremiah 29, "For I know the plans I have for you." As she read, she felt as if God were speaking directly to her. This message was a turning point. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt true peace. It didn't matter what the neighbors said, it didn't matter what her children thought. She knew she wasn't alone. She then decided to write a letter to Daniel, even though she didn't know if he would ever read it. "My son, I have never forgotten you. I pray for you every day. God willing, I want to look into your eyes before I leave this life." As she finished the letter, tears wet the paper. But this time, they weren't tears of despair, but of hope. Margaret knew she had placed in God's hands what she couldn't control. Faith also began to transform her attitude toward her children. Instead of arguing, she began to respond with gentleness. "I understand your pain, Susan. But one day you will see that God is capable of healing even the most wounded hearts." Linda saw the change and said, "Mom, you're stronger. You seem like a different person." Margaret smiled and replied, "It's not me, daughter. It's the Lord who lives in me." Even John, the neighbor, noticed the transformation. "Margaret, you have a light that no one can extinguish. Maybe this is what will bring your family back together." She thanked him, believing each word was part of a larger plan. Even with so many challenges, Margaret clung to the promise that the truth sets you free. Therefore, she was willing to face whatever came. Her heart burned with the hope that Daniel might still be found. One morning, she woke up startled to hear footsteps in the backyard. She ran to the window and saw a shadow moving away. Her heart raced. Was it just a curious neighbor, or someone trying to sneak up on her? Linda ran to her mother's room and found her in tears. "What happened?" Margaret pointed to the window and said, "I think Daniel is close. Much closer than we thought." At that moment, faith ceased to be merely a distant hope and became certainty. Margaret believed with all her heart that God was preparing a reunion, and that, even amid the city's judgment, victory was already on its way. It was late afternoon when someone knocked loudly on the door. Startled, Margaret opened it slowly. Before her stood a middle-aged man with familiar features, intense eyes, and a silence that spoke volumes. Are you Margaret?" he asked, his voice breaking. Her heart raced. It was as if time had stopped. For a moment, she didn't need confirmation. That man had to be Daniel. The shock was so great that Margaret nearly fainted. Linda rushed to support her as the man slowly entered. The silence that followed was heavy, as if all the years of absence were there, in the middle of the room. "I didn't come to judge you," Daniel said, staring at his mother. "I came because I received a letter. A letter that said it was time to know the truth." Margaret's eyes widened. "But I never sent any letter." Everyone looked at each other, confused. Who could have written that letter on Margaret's behalf? The surprise was so great that no one could speak. The first twist was before them. Susan entered the room and froze when she saw Daniel. "So it's true. He exists." Her voice was thick with disbelief. Robert froze, unable to accept the presence of this stranger who, at the same time, seemed so close. Daniel took a deep breath. "I grew up not knowing who my mother was. But recently, someone told me everything. Someone who said you were hiding the truth." He took a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Margaret. It was an old letter, written in Thomas's handwriting. "One day, I will seek what is mine." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Thomas was behind this. Had he contacted Daniel? Daniel continued, "I was raised by a good family, but I always felt like something was missing. I discovered too late that I was forcibly left. And now, I don't know if I've come to reconcile, or to understand the pain I carry." The room became a field of tension. Robert exploded. "So what did you come here for?" "To destroy what's left of our family." Daniel replied firmly, "I didn't come to destroy anything. But I want answers. And I'll get them." Margaret wept, trying to touch his face. "My son, forgive me. I've never stopped thinking about you." But Daniel recoiled. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the emptiness of decades, Mother. You took my entire life." Linda, overcome with emotion, approached. "Daniel, I know nothing can take back the past. But perhaps God is giving you a new chance." Her words brought a glimmer of hope, but the mood was still tense. Suddenly, John rushed in. When he saw Daniel, he turned pale. "My God, you look just like him." Everyone turned to John. "Who are you talking about?" Susan asked. The neighbor hesitated before saying, "Thomas." The silence shattered like shattered glass. Daniel tensed. "You knew my father?" John took a deep breath. "I did, more than I should have. And maybe I know things Margaret never told me." Margaret put her hand to her chest. "John, please don't do this." But he continued, "Thomas wasn't just a boy who disappeared. He left because he had made enemies. And that secret could explain a lot about what happened to Daniel." The second twist was beginning to unfold. It wasn't just about a lost son. It was about a shadowy past that involved not only Margaret but also people still alive. Daniel frowned. "So my father left me. That's it. He abandoned me too." Margaret tried to explain. "No, my son. He left because of bad choices. But I always fought silently for you." Susan, unable to contain her anger, said, "This is too much. First a lost brother, now secrets about a man we don't even know. How many more lies are there?" Linda tried to calm everyone down. "Maybe it's time to listen, to understand the whole story before judging." But Robert was unconvinced. "I don't want to hear it. This man isn't part of my life." Daniel stood up, tears in his eyes. "I didn't choose to be born, I didn't choose to be given away. But I have a right to be here. And if you don't want me to, I'm leaving right now." Margaret begged, "Please don't go. I couldn't bear to lose you again." She fell to her knees before him, hugging his legs. It was a heartbreaking scene. Daniel took a deep breath, hesitating. Finally, he said, "I'm not leaving now. But I didn't come to sweep it under the rug. I want the whole truth. No matter who it hurts." At that moment, John handed over an envelope he'd kept for years. Inside were old photos and a letter from Thomas. He said he'd be back. And I think someone out there is trying to fulfill that promise in his place. The third twist was in store. It wasn't just Daniel who had returned from the past. There was someone else involved, someone still moving in the shadows. Margaret's heart sank. "Who's doing this?" she asked, distressed. Daniel looked at John, then at his mother, and said, "Maybe my father never really left us. Maybe someone is continuing his story." The words echoed like thunder. The long-awaited reunion became a maze of unanswered questions. What had begun as a shock now turned into a much greater mystery. Susan slammed the door, unable to bear the weight of the situation. Robert sank into silence. Linda wept, but held on to hope. And Margaret, her hands trembling, prayed silently, "Lord, give me strength to endure what is yet to come." Night fell heavily on the house. No one could sleep. The shadows of the past walked among them again, setting the stage for the final revelation that would change everything forever. The sky was heavy with dark clouds when everyone gathered back in the living room. Margaret knew there was no escape. Daniel stood there, firm, waiting to hear what had never been said. The silence was so heavy that even the ticking of the clock seemed deafening. Linda was the first to speak. "It's time. We can't live with half-truths anymore." Susan, still irritated, crossed her arms. "I just want it all to be over. I can't take this theatrics anymore." Robert remained silent, but his eyes burned with fury. Daniel stared at his mother. "You owe me the whole truth, Margaret. Who was my father really? And why was I ripped from you?" His voice echoed like thunder. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. With tears streaming down her face, she finally said, "Thomas wasn't the man he seemed. He had shady dealings, dangerous enemies. I was just a girl, and I got too involved. When I found out I was pregnant, my family was in despair. Everyone held their breath." Margaret continued, "I was forced to sign your adoption to protect you. Thomas swore he would come back for you, but he disappeared. And to this day, I don't know if he's alive or dead." At that moment, John stood up. "I need to confess something. I knew more about Thomas than I should have. He was involved in smuggling, and before he disappeared, he left me a letter." John pulled a yellowed envelope from his pocket. Everyone stared as he opened the letter. Thomas's handwriting was clear. "If anything happens to me, make sure Daniel knows who he is. He shouldn't live in the dark." Margaret burst into tears. The revelation hit like a bombshell. Susan wept silently, Robert paced in circles, stunned. Linda hugged Daniel, who was teary-eyed, unable to process it all. "Then you never forgot me," Daniel said, looking at Margaret. "No, my son. You were with me in every prayer, in every tear, in every sleepless night," she replied, sobbing. It was at that moment that the door suddenly opened. An unknown man entered, adding even more shock to the scene. Tall, with a stern expression, he carried a folder full of papers. "Sorry to intrude, but you need to hear this." Everyone stood up, alert. The man introduced himself as a lawyer. "I'm representing a client who's interested in this house. But before any decision is made, you need to know the whole truth." He opened the folder and revealed documents linking Thomas to old debts related to the property. The eviction order wasn't a coincidence. Someone wants to cover up this story. And Margaret is at the center of it all. Margaret was stunned. So the eviction wasn't just for ordinary debts. The lawyer replied, "No. It was planned. Someone wants to force you out to end this cycle." Robert exploded. "So we're all being manipulated. Who's behind this?" The lawyer hesitated before replying, "A man who claims to be related to you, and who may have a direct connection to Thomas." Daniel shuddered. "Are you saying my father might be alive?" The lawyer didn't answer directly. "I'm just saying he never really disappeared. He chose to stay in the shadows." Susan screamed, "This is insane! You expect me to believe that ghost is back." But deep down, everyone was shaken. The idea that Thomas was still alive was too disturbing. Margaret clutched the crucifix tightly. "If he's alive, may God have mercy on him. Because what he did destroyed more than it saved." The atmosphere grew even more intense when Daniel said, "If my father is alive, I want to see him. I want to face the man who took me from my mother." Robert responded, "What if he's dangerous?" "You don't understand. You're messing with fire." At that moment, thunder echoed outside, as if nature itself was bearing the weight of the revelation. Linda held her mother's hands, trying to keep her upright. The lawyer handed over another document, a record indicating that Thomas had a brother living in the same city. "This man may have the answers you seek." The shock was general. Margaret murmured, "So, it was all so close all along." Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm not running away. I've spent my life without answers, and now I want them all. Whether my father is alive or just a ghost, I'm going to find out." Robert pounded the table. "And we're going together. I won't let my mother face this alone." For the first time, he demonstrated unity. Susan, still conflicted, couldn't object. Margaret felt her heart race. The climax of her life lay before her, her reunion with Daniel, Thomas's shadow, the threat looming over her home, and the family about to fall apart or come together once and for all. Tears streamed down her face as she said, "Lord, give me strength, because I know the truth is about to explode before us all." Tensions were running high. Daniel, Margaret, their children, and even their lawyer were caught in a web of revelations, each word stronger than the last. Past and present collided, poised to change the future. And just when it seemed like nothing else could happen, a phone rang. Linda answered and went pale. On the other end, a male voice said simply, "I think it's time we talked about Daniel." The line dropped, leaving everyone in shock. The silence was absolute. Who was that voice? Thomas? His supposed brother? Or someone even closer than they imagined? Margaret felt her body tremble. The climax was just beginning, and the answers would come at a high price. The family's fate was about to be sealed. The next morning, the house was filled with an unsettling silence. Everyone was still thinking about the mysterious call. Margaret paced the living room with her Bible in her hands, asking God for wisdom to face whatever lay ahead. Shortly afterward, the doorbell rang. When she opened the door, she found an elderly man with gray hair and a tired look. Upon seeing her, he said firmly, "Margaret, we're finally reunited." It was Thomas. The impact was devastating. Margaret clutched her chest, gasping for air. Daniel, upon seeing the man, felt his world spin. "You are my father." The entire room fell into absolute silence, awaiting the answer. Thomas took a deep breath. "Yes, I am your father. And I didn't come to ask for forgiveness. I came because you need to know the truth before it's too late." His words were like daggers piercing Margaret's heart. Susan exploded. "How dare you show up now after destroying our family?" Robert stepped forward, trying to contain his fury. But Daniel held up his hand. "Let him speak. I've waited my whole life for this." Thomas said he never really disappeared. He had gone into hiding because he was involved in dangerous business. "If I had stayed, you would have been destroyed with me. I was a coward, yes, but I thought I was protecting you." Margaret wept silently. "Protecting? You left me alone, humiliated, carrying a weight that nearly killed me." Thomas looked away, unable to look at her. Daniel, with tears in his eyes, asked, "And why did you never look for me? Why did you let me grow up believing that no one wanted me?" His father replied, "Because I knew the truth was too heavy for a boy." The tension was rising. Susan wanted him to leave. Robert didn't know whether to hate him or feel sorry for him. Linda, heartbroken, begged everyone to take a deep breath. It was then that Thomas revealed something even more disturbing. The eviction notice isn't just about debt. Someone is after you. Someone who wants revenge against me, and they're targeting you. Margaret froze. So all this wasn't a coincidence? The eviction, the letters, the threats. Thomas confirmed, "No. It's part of a network I created myself, and now you're paying the price." Daniel stood up, furious. "You stole my life twice. First you took me away from my mother, now you want to put me in danger. I can't forgive you, Father. Not now." Thomas, for the first time, cried. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to understand that I never stopped loving you. But my love was cowardly, hidden." The atmosphere was unbearable. Susan ran out, saying she couldn't take it anymore. Robert stood paralyzed, torn between hatred and compassion. Linda hugged her mother, trying to keep her from breaking down. It was then that Daniel made the hardest decision of his life. "I can't accept you as my father. But I can accept my mother. She always loved me, even in silence. And she's the one I want to lean on now." Margaret hugged Daniel tightly. "My son, you are the answer to all my prayers. I need nothing more than you." Tears fell like rain, washing away decades of pain. Thomas, defeated, got up to leave. "Maybe it's for the best. I've destroyed everything I've touched. I hope you find peace, even without me." And he walked out the door, disappearing into the falling rain. The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel wept in his mother's arms, while Linda stroked his hair. Robert, his heart hardened, left without a word. Susan didn't return that night. Margaret, even though torn apart, felt peace on one point. She could finally embrace her lost son. "God gave you back to me, Daniel. I'm not the same anymore. The wound still hurts, but now I can breathe." Daniel wiped away his tears. "I'm not the same anymore either. I grew up with so many questions, and today I found the answer. Maybe it's not the one I wanted, but it's the one I needed." The rain outside seemed to wash not only the streets, but also the souls of that family. Linda, moved, said, "We cannot change the past. But the future is still before us." Robert returned hours later, calmer. I don't know if I can accept all of this at once. But I'll try. At least for you, Mom." These words brought a breath of hope. Susan didn't return for days. When she did, she was still wounded, but she brought an open Bible with her. "I don't know if I can forgive, but I'll try. Maybe that's what God expects of me." Margaret smiled through her tears. "That's all I ask, daughter. Not perfection, not ready-made answers. Just the chance to start over." Daniel, now officially part of the family, finally felt at home. For the first time in decades, Margaret could look around and feel that, despite the losses, something had been restored. But the weight of the revelations still lingered. Who was behind the threats? Who truly wanted to destroy that family? These questions lingered, like echoes of a past that might never be fully resolved. Margaret, however, chose to no longer live in fear. "The truth set me free, even though it hurt. And I know God still has plans for us." At that moment, everyone gathered in prayer. There were no easy answers, no guarantees. But there was faith, and that was enough to carry on. Tears mingled with shy smiles. It was a beginning, not an end. The family was broken, but not destroyed. And Margaret, with Daniel by her side, finally felt whole. The outcome didn't bring complete happiness, but it did bring something greater: redemption. The pain was still there, but now it was accompanied by hope. And so, between tears and prayers, the grandmother who had been evicted found what she never imagined: not only the loss of her home, but the reunion with the missing piece of her soul. Dear friend listening, do you see how Margaret's life teaches us that no pain is in vain? Even after so much loss, rejection, and hidden secrets, God led her to a reunion that seemed impossible. This shows us that even when all seems lost, hope can always blossom. How many times have you felt judged, misunderstood, or even alone? What would you do if you had to face a secret that would change your family forever? Would you have the courage to reveal the truth, even at the risk of rejection? Margaret reminds us that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, but about choosing to move forward with faith. Have you ever had to forgive someone who broke your heart? Or needed forgiveness from someone you hurt? The great lesson here is that it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to restore bonds. It's never too late to surrender your pain to God and let Him transform it into victory. And I want to ask you, what part of this story touched your heart the most? Have you ever been through something similar? What would you do in Margaret's shoes? Share in the comments. I'd love to hear your experience. Before we go, I have a special request. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue following stories like this, full of emotion, faith, and hope. This helps me bring you even more transformative messages. And remember, no matter how heavy the burden you carry, never walk alone. God is with you every step of the way. And sometimes, the most painful revelation can be exactly the path to the liberation you've always sought.